chapter is going to be about controls, and although not mentioned, we're also going to be going over the master pages as well. Controls in ASP are rendered to the browser in markup that it can actually understand. Some of them are rendered as HTML, some of them are rendered as JavaScript, whereas others aren't rendered at all. The ones that aren't rendered at all are usually just to store variables or as placeholders for other controls. We'll start with the simple control, the label. Notice this ASP syntax, ASP label ID. Two important notes, run at server. This is required for a server control to actually be rendered and accessed in the code behind. You can also place this on regular HTML tags like divs, spans. You won't have access to all the special features that the ASP controls have, but you can still do certain things as actually accessing them in your code behind. Not entirely useful in most cases, but if you're using them as placeholders or if you need to set specific values on them, it really helps. The ID is also required if you want to access this from the code behind. When it's rendered, in the case of this label control we had, it just renders as a span tag. We can also, depending on if we'd set certain properties, such as the associated control ID on the label, it will actually change this into a label with a for and various other properties it would need for it. So all the properties you set and actually what it's used for, or wondering what the browser is, it will actually change this control tag as it's rendered. Common case is this between a desktop browser and a mobile browser as to what it will render as. Another concept that ASP does is it will actually mangle the name to ensure that the IDs are unique in the browser. This does cause a lot of problems if you don't expect this, because the IDs of the controls that the browser will see are, in some cases, drastically different than what you see in the code behind. If you place a control inside a master page, it'll actually change the ID to whatever placeholder is in the master page. In this case, it was called content placeholder 1, and then just keeps appending these on there as it goes through either master pages or child controls, so just to make sure it's actually unique. If you do need to access these from the client side, or at least know the client ID in your code behind, you would access the control.clientID. This is actually commonly used when you're dealing with JavaScripts or just anything that actually writes back the client needs to know about. More for client-side code. Another simple one is the text box control. Simple renders, you've seen these more or less. Quite similar to the label control, and it's just to get used input back from the user. When it's rendered, in this case we had a master page on here as well. It renders it as input name, then a control, content placeholder, text box 1. Not exactly easy to remember, and the more you nest these controls, the names will just get larger and larger and larger. But it ensures that it's actually unique across the page. Another common control is the drop-down list. When it's rendered, this is actually rendered to a select and option tags. If you've actually worked in HTML, you should know what these are. Working off a similar concept is the checkbox list. Notice it's almost identical to the drop-down box. All we changed was the checkbox was the up here. The checkbox list is now instead. Seems our image is kind of overlaid on there. But when it's rendered, it looks almost entirely different than the drop-down list did. It actually builds a table around it, sets the labels for it. And if you actually look, it actually created a label control and set the various tags on it. There's actually properties we can set on these controls, and it will completely change how it renders, so it won't build a table, it will actually just kind of drop them in line, or it will use various spans. It's actually rather configurable. In this case, we pay attention to the label control it uses. When using checkboxes, if you do assign a label to it that's actually associated with it, you can actually click on the label instead of just a checkbox, so you won't have to hunt and peck to hit it. In this case, a lot of the server controls that ASP renders by default uses tables for the layout. Not exactly consistent with most web standards, but it ensures a consistent layout across pages. As I said, you can actually assign various properties on the controls to change how it's rendered. And it doesn't usually touch the CSS styling, so you can override that as well. Concept of user controls, it allows you to group multiple controls that are commonly used, such as an address entry form, into a single place so you can reuse it across. We've created a simple user control, almost impossible to read for you back, but it simply renders out to this. Very simple, but as you noticed in the previous slide, it's a lot to type in over and over again on page after page. So that's what the concept of user controls comes in. If you register one to your page, you can actually start to simplify that. We've actually dropped in 2 of the same user control here. Notice it's a lot easier to write this and less error prone than having to copy, paste, and change values around. Introducing the concept of master pages with user controls. The old way of doing this in .NET or ASP 1.1 was you'd actually create multiple user controls across the page and you'd share them. When they came out with a new version of ASP, they realized this was not a very efficient way of doing it, so they introduced the concept of master pages. This is basically like you can start nesting your pages within each other. Notice the Inception reference, if you can see that. I don't know if there's a limitation on how far you can actually nest your controls, but realistically you wouldn't want to go more than 2 to 3 deep. Creating a master page is actually fairly simple. It's similar to page syntax, except at the top of the page, as you notice, there's a master reference instead of a page. And it just has all the various similar context. One thing to note is the content placeholders. When it's merged into a page, anything that's nested underneath it will actually drop into here. As I said, this is where the child controls are rendered. You need to have at least one of these on your master page, otherwise you can't render anything. And I believe ASP will actually complain at you because you didn't do so. Any content placeholders you have defined, your child pages have to have these referenced as well. So if you have 3 content placeholders in your master page, you have to have 3 inside your page. Using a master page is actually fairly simple. You just start swapping out, adding the content placeholders. In this case, we only have 1, but actually adding the master page, you can actually see the tag master page file ASP master, all the direct link to it. If you wanted to actually access properties within the master page, you have to add a second directive to the top of your page called the master type. This basically tells it what type of page the master is. And then if you do this in your code behind it, it'll create the master property where you can get any custom properties you have in there.